Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tea with TPS, informal conversations with thought leaders in India and abroad. Today, our distinguished guest is Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. He was Ambassador of India in Myanmar, Mexico, and High Commissioner of India in Kenya and South Africa. He has also served in several parts of the world in other capacities. But his life after the civil service, after the foreign service, has been even more exciting. Today, he is a distinguished fellow of the Foreign Studies program of the Gateway House. He was Director General of the ICWA. He had, of course, experience of South Asia in the Ministry of External Affairs. And now he's a prolific columnist, regular speaker on foreign policy, visiting research fellow in different institutes in India and abroad. And then he's also a very distinguished author. He has 3 books to his credit so far, and many are coming, I'm sure. The first on India in global affairs, regarding his term as the Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, I presume. And then he has written a major book, a significant book on Myanmar. Not very common to have books on Myanmar. And also a book on India-African relations, and again a rarity. You can get any number of books on India, US, India, Russia, India, Japan. But both these topics that he has chosen for his study are somewhat different from the usual kind of books that we have. So it's a pleasure to have you, Rajiv, and I hope we can have a fruitful conversation, not only for the two of us, but also for our audience. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Srini, for this very generous introduction, but more importantly, for this very warm invitation. You have created a wonderful platform, and I'm really honored to be here with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me. Well, this will be more in the form of a book chat, because I have had the pleasure of reading your book on Africa. And also I reviewed it for the Hindu, which published it with a rather interesting photograph, you can see, of the BRICS countries, heads of state. It's very significant because in the center you have Africa, and on both sides they are the big leaders of the world who are contending for Africa's heart. That's how I see it. So it's not normal for Hindu to publish such photographs with reviews, and so I thought it was a rather significant step that they have taken in publishing it like this. So that's been a pleasure. The book is, of course, a very scholarly one, which I have observed in my review, because normally when diplomats write books, they are basically memoirs, information that the others don't have, the scholars don't have, and you cannot get in the books. So what we normally do is we recall what we did in these countries and then relate it to the history, then assess your own experience and assess your own contribution, and then project a future. That's the kind of books I have written, and that's the kind of books many diplomats have written. But you have been different in the sense that this is basically a scholarly book. In fact, you will barely notice that you had the experience of serving as India's envoy in Kenya and South Africa. Why this different approach?
Thank you very much for asking a very important question in terms of my life as an academic and the style that I developed. This must have something to do with my attachment with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies based in Singapore, when they chose me as a visiting fellow to commission this book on Myanmar that you referred to. And when I went and met the director there and other senior people, they actually said exactly the reverse of what you have just said, namely, you have spent 36 years in diplomatic life. That was wonderful. You have obviously acquired massive experience of diplomacy. But they said, we want a book which would be scholarly in nature, which means it should be based on deep research and it has to be backed with lots of evidences that show that you have actually studied the subject, not just reflecting practice of diplomacy. So that was the first book. It was very well received, and therefore I thought, why tinker with a successful formula? And therefore, this Africa book also has followed in the same tradition. I do want to be taken seriously by the scholarly community, but you will appreciate that there are some episodes that I have mentioned selectively, while keeping the other ones for eventually, my own memoirs of the entire diplomatic innings.
Oh, that'll be very good. But when you look at this, your basic proposition is the Africa has a future. And that too, that the 21st century, as Ramaphosa said at one time, belongs to Africa. And this is the premise that you have followed in the whole book. But when you go into details, you might find certain contradictions, in the sense that you yourself have admitted that we have good relations with only, say, 15 or 16 of the 54 countries. So how can you presume that you can make a judgment on Africa? That's one question. And the other one, Mr. Sreenivasan, the former Foreign Secretary himself, has mentioned in his foreword. How do you justify writing a book on India-Africa relations? Will you write a book on India-Europe relations? Will you write a book on India-Latin America relations? Won't it be more appropriate to deal with specific countries rather than Africa as a whole? Because African Union is not a reality. It is still a myth. So how do you justify writing a book on India-African relations when 40 of those countries are not covered at all?
Let me explain the title and the treatment of the theme. Indeed, Africa is a continent. It's not a country. Africa has 54 recognized countries. And if we go by the membership of the African Union, actually there are 55 countries. So clearly, there are approaches that you can adopt in terms of handling this subject. Africa does have a tremendous degree of uniformity or unity, at least, given their history, given the history of colonialism and then liberation and then trying to come up on the international stage in a proper manner. Therefore, what I have done is actually to attack this whole theme at three different levels. One is at the level of the continent, and this is done by a very serious analysis of the India-Africa Forum summits, three of which took place, as you know, in the last decade. On the other hand, the second level is the regional dimensions, and therefore one has come across a number of important regional economic communities which find a place here. And then thirdly, at the bilateral level, you are absolutely right. There was no way for a scholar with limited time and with limited experience to write about India's relations with all 54 countries. In fact, we may not even have relations with all 54 countries. So there I had to be subjective. I gave myself a kind of a criteria or criterion, and based on that, I decided to select 15 countries that are important to India, countries which are important in Africa also, and then sat down and analyzed the present state of relations between each of those countries and India. So this was the issue with regard to the, why write a book on the continent. It is about the relationship with Africa. But I may just add one more point, which is that it's a bit different from the conventional books on this theme, because I have gone into some depth, as you know, in terms of explaining what Africa is all about today, and also explaining what is the international angle onto Africa, the third scramble for Africa, so to say. And finally, I've also spoken at some length about Africa-China relationship. So my justification for this theme is that India and people abroad need to know more about Africa, but it has to be done in a limited format, in a readable kind of book.
Right, that's fair enough. But you say this reason for your book is a passion for Africa. Can you explain it? What is your passion for Africa? What do you consider attractive for Africa, for an individual, for a diplomat, or a researcher?
First of all, I think history gives us a deep and natural empathy for the people of Africa. Here is a continent which suffered immensely at the hands of the West, particularly Europe. It was a wonderful continent before the Europeans arrived there. Natural habitat for men and animals, tremendous biodiversity. And if you believe some of the serious African historians, it was largely a peaceful, tranquil place with its own culture, its own traditions, communities living together harmoniously. Of course, in very difficult circumstances because there were forests and there was not too much of civilization. But European colonialism came, and before that, of course, slavery. Between these two phenomena, the people suffered. They were subjugated, they were oppressed, their freedom was taken away, their lands were taken away. And then for next 500 years or so, they had neither their own governance nor their growth. So as Indians who suffered also at the hands of the British Raj, there is a very natural affinity. This is one part. And Srini, my second point is that the beauty of Africa, the greatness and tranquility and generosity of African people, you cannot experience until you go and live with them. I lived there and I traveled there and I worked there in 3 countries, Kenya as India's High Commissioner, South Africa, as you also mentioned, as India's High Commissioner, and also covering another small country, Lesotho. So through these travels and through personal experiences, I felt that this is a place which is wrongly described as the dark continent. Dark means we are ignorant about it. But this continent has tremendous opportunity, tremendous potential. And my final point, I don't want to give long answers. Today, Africa represents 15% of world population. By the end of this decade, the figure will go to 20%. By mid-century, Africa will be 25% of the world population. So you can imagine, if we want to do some good for the world, we have to begin by doing some good, some cooperation, some positive things for 1/4 of humanity.
Well, Rajiv, you were my immediate successor in Kenya. So I was thinking about my own experience compared to whatever you have said in the book. You mentioned India's links with Africa soon after colonization, and even before that, Indians were there in various ways. But is there a real relationship between Indians and the Africans? Because we went there, most Indians went there to work in the railway line, or later they became money lenders. Then they became the visible faces of these countries, businessmen. Then they became the Africans worked in these homes. 4 or 5 Africans would be working in an Indian home doing various things. And the disparity between the Indians and the Africans is very evident. So don't you see there are so many negative elements about our past with Africa? Would you agree with that?
First of all, I remember very well that I stepped into very large shoes when I went to Kenya. You were a very popular High Commissioner. And then this thought of going into a house where you and Madame Lekha were subjected to a tragic and heinous attack was something very personal to me. I felt both sadness and anger, and if I may be very frank, also some fear. One felt that if this has happened to you, uh, they could come and repeat it. So all those negative thoughts that you mentioned, I've gone through them and I lived them for many months, the initial period in Kenya. But as the time passed and as one gained more and more courage and as one explored more and more the country and the region, I think that negativity turned into a positivity. To say first about the Indians there, because you have referred to the diaspora. Indian diaspora, as you know, is a part and parcel of the African landscape. Of about 31 million people around the world, that constitute Indian diaspora, about 10%, that is about 3.1 million people live on this continent. They are not in all 54 countries, as you know. There are major concentrations in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. And now the number has also increased in some of the Western African countries like Nigeria as well. Indians have done well for Africa and also for themselves. They have been in the cabinet, they have been in the parliament, they have been in business, in philanthropy, in construction. Most of them went originally, obviously, riding on the shoulders of the British Raj, but then they stayed on and they brought in more kith and kin and they contributed to Africa. And of course, as you know very well, the biggest non-resident Indian who really grew up in a way, intellectually and spiritually, was none other than Mahatma Gandhi himself, who became a big bond. So overall, I would say the Indian connection has been a positive, strong connection between India and Africa.
Well, since you referred to my own incident, I must clarify that I was not affected by it beyond a point. In the sense that when I went to Kenya, one of the first things I said that I'd like to do whatever is possible for India-Kenya relationship. So when I was hurt, what I told the press was that a bit of shedding blood may be part of it. And I also attributed it to general atmosphere of violence and not as a personal attack on me. It is still not known what the reason was. There are 23 theories I have listed in my book. But none of it is credible. But the interesting thing was that the opposition expected me to influence the existing government or convince the Indians that they should also invest in the opposition. So in other words, they looked at the Indian community as some kind of a support or some kind of a partner in what they are doing. And therefore, they expected the Indian High Commissioner to play a role. As you know, no diplomat can claim that you are playing a role in the internal affairs of that state. And as you said, the experience after that, normally most diplomats, when they have an incident like that, leave. It has happened to several other diplomats. I am the only one who stayed on almost my full term. This surprised many people. The government of India was willing to transfer me anywhere I wanted. But I said there are only 3 people out of the 30 million, so why should I leave? And that is the line I took. And I think that gave me some advantages vis-a-vis the Moi government. He was particularly sympathetic and considerate and he did exceptional things for me whenever I asked. He always said, you are a different high commissioner. And he expected me to actually fight for UNEP and Habitat to remain in Nairobi. Because after many of these incidents, there was a move to move the UN headquarters from Nairobi. And I did. And that was also much appreciated in spite of the trouble that I had. So I'm not allowed my experience to color my judgment of Africa. I wanted to say that clearly. But what I found...
I want to comment that, if you allow me, because I remember very well that not merely the friends of the High Commission, But the community leaders, not just in the Indian community, but also in the Kenyan side, they were always very, very appreciative of your courage. And they also, many of them used to be very apologetic.
Yes.
That this happened to an Indian diplomat, to someone who sat in the chair which was occupied by a luminary like Appa Saheb Pant, who really did a lot for Kenya. So in a way, if I may say, that seat of the Indian High Commissioner in Kenya is our common bond. And I may add that that seat brought me also very close to danger on that day when terrorists attacked the US Embassy in Nairobi. Our High Commission, as you know, is just next door. And the Indian High Commission too was affected badly, including the High Commissioner's office, the very seat in which you sat, and then I sat. But those are now stories of the past, and we are here to tell the tale.
No, right. So I'm not, dwelling at length on that. But what arises from that is that we have all been competitors in Kenya. Did we have any specific advantage as India in Kenya? I found that we did not have, because the Kenyans generally were looking for help, assistance, freebies, free scholarships, and there were several countries willing to offer that. And our own technical assistance program, which has the philosophy that the receiving countries must also contribute to the costs of those experts, etc., was not very attractive to them in the first instance. And first we competed with the white people soon after colonialism. Even now, the British, if you are a white person with a huge estate somewhere outside in the villages, has a much greater recognition than anybody else. And then we had to compete with the Japanese, then the Koreans, and now the Chinese. So do we have an advantage in Africa because of our tradition of support to them, or the freedom struggle we have supported, etc.? Have we been able to get any diplomatic advantage for what we have done so far?
Right. I think that's a very interesting and a question that compels a reflection. I would say that, yes, competition is very much there. That cannot be denied. The competition emanates from, first of all, the Western countries, which, as I mentioned, the European countries, which subjugated it, Britain, France, Belgium, in many ways, in different ways, Holland. And then later, when the US came in, and particularly during the Cold War, they poured in a lot of assistance, arms, technical people. So they were all there. And India certainly had the image and perception of a country which helped them in terms of contributing to their liberation. It also helped them in terms of creating the third way when the Cold War period, the world and Africa was divided into Western and Eastern, Western and communist camp. But I think today, if we are focusing our attention on the last 3 decades, and the thrust of my book is very much about the last 3 decades rather than the last 100 years, I can say with confidence that I met a lot of African leaders, officials, ministers, ordinary people, who could think of India in very positive terms, that India is a democracy and it is developing well, that it has hospitals where we can send our relations for getting well, that India has universities where our children can go and study, that India has done so well in the field of IT, in the field of pharmaceutical. This is something Africans, informed Africans, do understand very well. But you are right about, this is still a kind of a persistence of negativity. And if I may just end this particular part to say that this is, Srini, partly due to the lack of, media linkages between India and African countries. We have a good story to tell, but that story has to go through Reuters and AP and AFP and Washington Post. And however good the story may be, it gets darkened. And similarly, tell me, how much do we read even today or see Africa on our televisions or in our newspapers? Very little. So there is a problem that this wall of ignorance has to be punctured or brought down. And this is my very humble effort. You've been very kind to show the uh, picture of the book on the cover. I just want to say that it is a book with two covers. This is the South Asia edition. The mask is a Kenyan mask, which I purchased in Mombasa some 20 years back. It's still there at our home, representing Africa. The lotus represents India, and the blue tinge is the Indian Ocean. So we are neighbors across the ocean. And very quickly, the global edition came out earlier. And this shows clearly a book which will be available in all major towns such as New York and London. So I'm very grateful to Routledge and to everybody who helped me to put across the Indian perspective to the wider world on Africa.
Right. I mean, there's no question that it has a wealth of information. But what I'm trying to do is to get an assessment from you, which is not in the book. Everybody can read the book.
Indeed.
So that is the purpose of this.
Indeed, absolutely. I'm with you.
So when we say that Africa has a future, you yourself recount several difficulties in that, right? The rate of growth, their capability to do with the modern phenomena like digitalization, globalization, growth, basic African unity, too many disputes among them. In fact, the United Nations peacekeeping operations are most active in Africa to deal with internal conflicts. So when you see all this, unless there is a basic change in, first of all, economic development, and then a sense of unity in the African Union, these are lacking. And therefore, for us to devise any strategy which would involve, embrace all the African continents and the whole continent is a difficult task which you yourself admit. But where are the positive features? So you mentioned already some of them. But as a practicing diplomat, if you were to improve your relations with Africa, in my case, out of my 2.5 years there, I spent a lot of time on my wheelchair, so I was not very mobile, first of all. Secondly, I viewed my posting to Nairobi as more of a multilateral post than a bilateral post. So I spent a lot of time dealing with Habitat and UNEP, which was my interest because I went from New York to Nairobi together with many other multilateral diplomats who had come there. And so my perspective was very different, I admit that. But when you think of improving relations with Africa for a new diplomat who goes there, what exactly are the positive features that you can count on?
Yes.
Other than what you mentioned over.
No, you're absolutely right. And that is the question that can be answered very directly. African growth is a reality. When the demography grows, that means that there are so many more people requiring goods, services.
You say demography is the most highest the growth in population is in Africa. Is that right? Globally?
Yes. The rate is quite phenomenal. And so here the point is that let me give you the example of our own trade with Africa. And it's quite dramatic. In the past 20 years, what has happened is really significant. In 2001, India-Africa trade was barely $5 billion. 15 years later, that is in 2015, it had shot up to about $72 billion. India now was buying much more petroleum and the crude oil from oil-rich countries in Africa, and India was selling much more of IT products, pharmaceutical products, financial services, IT, and the rest of it to Africa. So from 5 to 72, this was a very significant development. Secondly, India's investments in Africa, they have grown up in the last 7 or 8 years. They have grown up by about $15 billion. Today, they stand at about $70 billion. In the past 15 to 20 years. But more importantly, I think the Indian government has decided to open 18 new missions in Africa. If Africa was really not progressing, India, which is generally very careful with its money, would not be opening 18 new diplomatic missions in Africa. So the point I'm making is that the Africa story is not a straightforward linear story. We know that when countries began to get independence in the 60s, there was the age of hope. Then we had the age of lost hopes for the next 30 years. The news that came from Africa was bad news: poverty, corruption, medical disasters, health disasters, and the rest of it. But things really began to change after South Africa emerged as the new democratic nation in the mid 1990s. And in the twin leadership, first of Nelson Mandela, whom I had the honor to meet, and then later his successor, Thabo Mbeki, as the president, they created the basis of African rejuvenation. And as a result, the first decade of the present century, it was very good for Africa. The African growth shot up from about 3.5% per year to about 6%. And then in the second decade, it slowed down. And therefore, overall, I can say that the investment that India made since about, say, 2008 to 2019 in increasing and deepening the relationship, that showed clearly India's official assessment that Africa has potential. Africa is on the right track. It is trying to improve its governance. It is trying to turn democratic. It is trying to create security and inclusiveness for its people. And therefore, India wanted to stand with Africa. So particularly, finally, Srini, when I was in South Africa, I saw the decisive way in which China was coming in. And that was yet another additional reason why India had to be on its best in order to give competition.
Right. So would you say directly that our investments there are paying dividends already, or you are thinking in terms of the future?
I think I have to be very honest. Certainly, we have made some good decisions, some poor decisions. But when we are in Africa, we certainly have to think of medium term and the long term. Exactly how, when Europeans and Americans and Japanese came to invest in India, South Koreans came to invest in India back in the 1990s, they also took time before India truly took off. Today, the profitability in India is beyond question. The same thing will happen in Africa, but a little later. In fact, the first decade gave tremendous hopes, and everybody turned Afro-optimist. Then in the second decade, once again, optimism got blended with pessimism and people became realistic. And yet it was still very much a positive orientation before the COVID era descended on Africa. And as you know, in the last 3 years, COVID era has been difficult for the world. It has been especially difficult for Africa. But I remain optimistic very much on the medium-term future of Africa.
No, but then you are not saying whether we have already won the dividends in terms of investment. No. You are thinking more of the future, right?
I mean, on economic, purely on economic thing, but in terms of political and strategic, relationship, I feel India has been gaining a lot of goodwill, lot of support, and the very fact that these 3 summits took place. One more thing, Srini, I did work on a table of VVIP visits, very, very important persons visits from India to Africa. This is revealing. From 1947 to 2014, the presidents and prime ministers and vice presidents of India found very little time or reason to go to Africa. But in this 4-year period, 2015 to 2019, almost every 3-4 months, one of our VVIP was in Africa. This showed that Africa could realize that India is turning and appreciating its importance. So those visits have created a certain degree of goodwill. We have to leverage those dividends, and that only will happen as soon as we are able to overcome the disastrous effects of COVID. I have a few views, but I'll come to that later.
Well, as far as visits are concerned, if you look at UAE, for 25 years, no Indian Prime Minister had visited the UAE. So we were always focused on the West and the Americas and so on. And so
Absolutely.
we did not have the initiative or interest in this. But that has changed. But that has also changed because of our own, what we now call the assertive foreign policy since 2014. We have started looking at different countries, trying to fill in the gaps, etc. Certainly, the period that you are talking about is the period after I left Africa. I left in very, very early 1997. And so the period that you're talking about is a new resurgence. I accept that. But the difficulty at that time was, for example, I did a major exhibition called Made in India with CII. And the most leaders of industry were there at that time, 96, 97. And I tried to persuade them. Of course, they came and participated with great enthusiasm. President came and parties and so on. But I had separate meetings with these people, and I tried to explore what we can expect out of this Made in India. How much are you going to export to Kenya? How much are you getting support? What have you learned from this experience? They had nothing to say. And then finally, the chairman told me, look here, Mr. High Commissioner, we go to a country where we get at least 25% profit. We go to a country where our people have a comfortable living without any threat to their security. We go to a country where there are facilities for us, our families, to live in comfort. Do you have this in Kenya? So what do you answer?
Right.
What's your answer?
Yeah. No, I think I have to be respectful, but also emphatic in explaining that things have changed in many parts of Africa. From the late 90s. I think, and I'm talking up to the COVID era before it began. There was a very positive atmosphere. I think in my own terms elsewhere, I found that Indian visitors were always, very enthusiastic. There was a massive increase, for example, in the tourist traffic from India. In some of these countries, Botswana, Rwanda, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and I can assure you, Srini, as I'm sure it was the case in your time, Indian tourists, and of course other tourists, they never left Africa disappointed. They really got the full worth of their money because Africa had so much to offer. Similarly, if I draw your attention to the third India-Africa Forum Summit, I mean, who would have thought back in the 1990s that India would place 50,000 training fellowships at the disposal of Africans, and that they will almost get completely used by African students and officials who wanted to come for training in India. If we go around the leading hospitals in Mumbai, Chennai, Delhi, I mean, Africans like Arabs, they come for what is called medical tourism. So facilities are very much there. There is a need and a potential for India to focus more on exporting its digital expertise that especially we have acquired in the past few years. I think some work is taking place in that context, and that is why let me say, looking to the future a little bit, as soon as we are able to recover from the COVID era, I think it's important for India to have a plan to recapture the momentum of the early years of the Modi government era. I think we have to be objective. We have to give credit to the present government, which put a very special life into the strategic aspects of India-Africa relationship. And yet, when COVID came, that momentum became a little weak. So I recommend strongly in my book that there should be a plan. I've given some components of the plan. We have every reason to believe that a country which will, a continent which will be 25% of the world population, which has massive land resources, which have minerals, which have commodities, which have young people. And by the way, this is going to be a very young continent. Long after China and India begin to turn around and become old, Africa would still be very young. So keeping all those in mind, I think we should not judge Africa by our perceptions of 70s, 80s, 90s. We should hope that they will stand and realize their potential.
Okay, accept that. Let's turn to South Africa. I have not lived there, but I visited there, particularly for Nelson Mandela's inauguration of the elders. I was there and I met several, including Nelson Mandela himself, and so on, very, very pleasant, etc. But political experience with South Africa, mine is all at the United Nations. And I must say that we have not received the kind of support that we expected from South Africa as a friend, for whom we have made many things. Of course, Mahatma Gandhi connection you already mentioned. This is something that we cherish very much. But is it a real bond? Do they really think that Mahatma Gandhi was the savior of Africa? The perception there sometimes is that he worked for the Indian community in South Africa. He suffered for them, and he, of course, eventually got freedom for India. But what has Mahatma Gandhi done for South Africa or Africa as general? Is there an understanding? Is there appreciation?
Very good question, and I agree to the basic premise. I think Mahatma Gandhi never claimed that he did anything directly for the blacks, the local people of South Africa. His entire work largely was for the Indian community, and he succeeded to a large extent. But what was more significant was that he treated South Africa as the laboratory for his experiments with truth and satyagraha. He developed those weapons. He brought them into India and became instantly the national leader. Yet, when he succeeded in emerging as the father of nation and giving us our freedom, that sent a very loud message to the world, including to Africa. So, in the process, Africa produced its own leaders, and many of them, not all, many of them sooner or later followed Mahatma Gandhi's path. Now, here I must concede straight away that there is a asymmetry of perception in Africa today. There are some young people and some revisionists who question Mahatma Gandhi's legacy and contribution. And you would have read very much, as we all have seen, this whole business of controversy about some of the Gandhi statues, etc. But the bulk of the societies and the leadership, starting from Nelson Mandela himself, have always sincerely projected their appreciation for the greatness of Mahatma Gandhi. And this came through, frankly, very clearly in my one-to-one with Nelson Mandela. By then, he was not any longer the president. He gave me the great honor to be able to call on him. And at this 40-minute meeting, half of the time, Nelson Mandela only talked about two people. First, he started with Mahatma Gandhi, and he quizzed me very sharply. He said, "What happened to the man who assassinated Mahatma Gandhi?" And when I said, "Sir, he was hanged he was, he sounded very surprised. He said, but Gandhi's successor Nehru, or the leader who took over India after that, he believed in Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence. So how could, the assailant be hanged? So I had to explain that there is a certain process of law and everything, and it is true that the man was hanged. And then the rest of the time he was talking about Jawaharlal Nehru. And I think one quick point which I bring out in my book is that while Gandhiji undoubtedly, made Indians aware of Africa in general because he came from there. I went to that railway station where he was thrown out of the railway compartment and became the potential liberator of India at that night, on that night. But the mainly Nehru is, uh, you know, uh, retained his legacy as somebody who made Indians aware of Africa, who made India conscious of Africa. So, in all, I mean, in short, all that I can really say is that uh, our leaders from Mahatma Gandhi to Narendra Modi, honestly, and I'm putting it in a very sober, balanced, historical manner, do enjoy a positive image in African uh, elites, thinking people, reading people, and they have an overall positive, very positive view of uh, India's industry, business, and governance.
No, but do they have a positive image of India today? And are there issues on which we agree? For example, take up the question, think of the question, the nuclear question, for example. Of course, South Africa takes pride in the fact that it had the capability but did not use it. But they do not agree or appreciate the fact that India has tried for denuclearization of the world. Then we went hesitantly to manufacture a nuclear weapon because we had no other choice. Such things are not appreciated, at least among the UN South African delegates in the United Nations. They take a very aggressive posture, like others, saying that India, Mahatma Gandhi is India. How can you go and experiment with nuclear weapons? So they are grateful, they are, pleasant, etc., etc. But I could not see any kind of appreciation or understanding of India's sensitivities.
I agree with you.
There was a famous non-aligned conference where this question of, we always criticize racism, etc. But at the same time, when the question came was casteism was racism, we did not get any support from the South African delegation.
I agree. In the first decade after 1994, there were quite a lot of wrinkles between Indian diplomatic machinery and the South African diplomatic machinery. There is no doubt on that. But things have again evolved there as well. There was this whole question that South Africa had become independent, but it was taking time to grow out of the old mindset, you know. So that I think has changed. Now, it is a more inclusive society relatively. And I think particularly after Mbeki took command, and then now you have Zuma and then Ramaphosa. Uh, there's still always a little bit of a sense of competition between India and South Africa for the constituency of Africa. Yet, India-South Africa relationship is very warm and cooperative. Bilaterally, I mean, this is one of the best markets for us. South Africa is the gateway for Indian industry and business to go into Southern Africa. And then on top of that, two organizations, IPSA, where India, South Africa, and Brazil formed and ran this grouping quite successfully. We improved each other and helped each other. And then finally in BRICS, when BRICS represented the constituency of the South, and you showed right in the beginning that photograph, that also shows that India-South Africa relationship today is far more positive and cooperative than it was in the early years after the emergence.
Okay. There again, we are talking of a period which I was not familiar with.
Indeed.
I'm aware of it also. But as far as BRICS is concerned, it was we who brought South Africa into it. It was only BRIC initially, as you may recall.
Absolutely.
So everywhere when we talk about leading developing countries, we automatically include South Africa. I mean, that is in our blood. But that emotional linkage that we have with South Africa is lacking in the policies of South Africa, at least was lacking in the policies of South Africa when I dealt with them in various international fora. But now, coming to the more positive aspects of it, China is a big competitor. And how is it going? Well, China has more resources, more ability, more willingness, more diplomats who committed to Africa. There are several points on which they are more ardent towards South Africa. It's not only South Africa, we take Myanmar also, the same story. Their passion for Myanmar is much more than what we have. So that is a plus point. Plus, they have a lot of money. How do we expect to counter that? Are we be able to? Is South Africa getting demoralized or disillusioned about China? And does it give an opportunity to step in?
With your permission, let me take this at the Africa-wide perspective, and I'll certainly answer about South Africa as well. My own reading is that undoubtedly China has done a lot of work to help Africa and South Africa in particular, especially in the field of infrastructure, but they have gone beyond infrastructure. The question is, how is it taken? Is it taken negatively or is it taken positively? My research showed that there are fundamentally three schools of thought. There is the positive school, which obviously is influenced and led by either the Chinese agencies or pro-Chinese elite of Africa. They are, eulogizing China's contribution to the development of Africa. The second school is the negative school, and that is very much supported by the West and some of the other countries, which say that, look, China is exploiting Africa, China is putting it into debt trap, they bring their labor, they do not create jobs, and therefore China in Africa is bad news for Africa.
And also the minerals and etc. they are taking away. That is another major charge.
Exactly. But the third school argues that China in Africa story should not be seen in the black or white colors. There is a lot of gray there. Undoubtedly, Africans are becoming more and more aware of this dependency on China, which is not running or promoting their interests. There is no doubt on that. And yet, many of the thought leaders in Africa point out that it is because of China's paying so much attention to Africa that the rest of the world started doing the same. And there, the Africans feel very happy because they feel and they say very openly that we need all the resources that we can get from different sources. And so I think my only basic comment here is that we in India should certainly study this critically, but we should particularly draw lessons for our relationship as to what we have to avoid in terms of mistakes made by China. We in India in particular should carefully and critically study China's role in Africa in order to draw right conclusions for us. If, for example, in terms of delivery, Chinese are often very effective, then we must study as to how they do it and whether we can also further improve and enhance our delivery of projects. But on the other hand, the acceptability of Indian experience is high because, they know Indians and India much better than they know the Chinese people. And we have to therefore leverage all our strengths in China as well. And that's why, may I just mention an interesting tidbit. When I started writing this book on India-Africa relations, I thought I don't have to bring China in, but my then well-wisher said that, without China, this will not work. And therefore, I added a separate chapter called Africa-China Tango. And I think that adds to the value of this work.
That's the chapter I read with greater care than any other. Because our concern, just as in Myanmar, you have been there too, where we are in, our policies are often guided by the fact that we should not allow Myanmar to be the total embrace of China. That's a fact. So same in South Asia, same in Africa. So writing about a country without China at the moment is like, Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. So that I think is
absolutely. That was the takeaway.
But all these questions do not add up to any kind of pessimism on myself. What I was trying to do to identify the good points about India-Africa relations from the perspective of someone who has seen some of these negative elements. So I'm more than convinced by your book that there is great scope. But as you yourself say, we need to give it greater attention. We need to invest more. Our mindset has to change. Our prejudices must move. All these are also there. So it is not just a question of a one-way expectation from Africa, but taking time away or attention from other parts of the world to focus on Africa. That's what we need to do. And that I don't think our government is yet there, or even our diplomats. How many diplomats volunteer to go to Africa, for example? This was the case in the Gulf. Many people did not offer to go to the Gulf earlier, but now everyone wants to go to the Gulf. So when relations improve, the prosperity increases, naturally this will naturally
absolutely
prosper. But at the moment we are at a turning point, and that is the relevance of your book. Because people who have not focused on these issues like me have been able to do it because of the wealth of information, knowledge, and expectation that you have got. That is the merit of the book. Let me compliment you on that. And thank you very much indeed for sparing the time. And I'm sure this will be valuable to our viewers also. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for creating this opportunity. I know that you have a lot of love for Africa in your heart. You worked there and you showed and proved that. And I also very much hope that we would have a better plan to recapture that momentum, because honestly, I'm convinced that India-Africa relations will have a better future. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rajiv.
Namaskar. Thank you.